Our next speaker is Daniel Goldman from the Planetary Insight Center. Edge of is a game and simulation developer. He's developed SimCity, for example, and he'll be talking to us about the gaming approach to collaborative action. Daniel, over to you.
Hi, nice to be here. My virtual background seems to have disappeared. I'm Daniel Goldman. I'm going to talk a little bit about simulation from a gaming and education perspective and how it can help prepare for and manage in a crisis. I'm founder here in Tokyo of Planetary Insight Center, which is a simulation and visualization center out of the Edge of in Tokyo, which is kind of a community game changer studio. And I got my start in simulation as a senior developer with SimCity, SimEarth, and moved on to working on projects with the EPA and the World Health Organization, and then just as kind of a hobby for myself. One of the first and foremost things about a disaster simulation is that while they can tell what might happen, they're pretty bad at telling what actually will happen when real people are involved, because there's so many ways a scenario can play out. It's very dynamic. But it does help you understand, and that's a key thing for us. That's been a key thing in past projects. Obviously, it's a key element related to trust is how do we make these complex and dynamic systems more understandable? How do we understand another person's point of view in a system when they care about different things? And how do we allow policymakers and citizens to experiment with different paths, different courses of action, understand the issues and benefits that might arise, especially potentially catastrophic, unintended and unexpected consequences, and to do that safely. And that's part of what drew me to simulation and some of the other people that I work with, that a key benefit of these simulations is really as a foil for discussion. It's a bit of an art piece that you can look at the various factors involved in a situation, and it can provide a catalyst for examination and learning. But then it can also provide a way to incorporate different people's point of views and see what they are. So I can see something from your point of view, and you can see it from my point of view, what really matters to me. I think it also really helps address head on some of the issues around trust. How do people in charge really anticipate issues and get ahead of them in these complex situations that are rapidly changing? And how do you give a digestible picture of why those decisions are being made to other people and let them participate in it? And I'll give an example from my kids. So my two sons, 7 and 11, live here with me in Tokyo. They're glad to be here and pretty safe in Tokyo. But they got a little concerned, definitely here, and also looking what's happening where they're from, California. And so I made a little simulation. It runs on the web. And we're able to see kind of how social distancing and some other good practices could make people more healthy. So it allowed them to approach the topic in a less fearful and more of a curious way that they could play around with. A lot of people are very familiar with games now. But it also then allowed us to think of things that we hadn't thought of. It was kind of that foil for discussion. So they're keeping additional factors to consider, additional things we wanted to put in, not just whether people go to work and to school, but how do they get food? Who takes care of the water? One of my kids said, well, what happens if the water people get sick, right? Or the power people get sick? Who needs to be protected for the system to work, right? What happens if 20% of those people are just out because they're too sick to work? So one of the things that came out of this session of simulations was the idea of cross-training people who'd recovered from the virus and who we hope are immune and who may have lost their jobs into vital positions in other industries as this continues, because it could continue for a while. And so this is a little microcosm, but to me it was pretty fascinating and reaffirming that by creating something where citizens can get engaged, where kids can get engaged and contribute their ideas, it really allows them to participate. It gives them an aspect of agency in a system that otherwise they're just kind of a victim to, and really potentially a way for them to make a contribution or have an insight that really could have a sincere impact, a tangible and large impact, not just on the local community, but at the national level, if there's a way for these things to get back up. One of the things I had seen come in the United States was a group that's volunteering to bring food to the elderly. So my parents are in their 80s and they're staying in place in their home in California. And my sister, I said they're not to go out and get things because they're in a high risk group. my sister's getting food for them. But places where that's not possible, people are already self-organizing. So seeing those things kind of ahead of time through a simulation or other common discussion medium for people like we're doing here over Zoom is a really powerful way for communities to come together and plan for the future, with or without government involvement. One of the other things we found really useful of this process is it's a bit of you put it as kind of a leaky sieve, meaning as you continue to add things into a simulation, it becomes more complex than most people would want to handle or see, and more complex than you'd use in just an educational setting. But as it does that, and as you get these cascading interdependent issues, it really helps you anticipate things you may need to address down the road that otherwise many of the stakeholders and scenario planning people would find very hard to engage with. And on a positive note, the simulation combined with government and citizen engagement can really help us make it through issues like this in a better position for the future, incorporating these best international practices in light of local differences. And there's a project we have going with Ethiopia around agriculture where we're trying to do that, is how do you bring in an international possibility space to local people and resources, but then give them the agency with this simulation analytical tool to make their own decisions with best practices. And that's about it, to keep it kind of short, but I look forward to the discussion with everyone.
Fantastic. I mean, just to sort of jump in there, I love that you're using simulation to prepare your children. And you're using simulation to sort of give sort of first, second, third order effects quickly to them so that they know, right, what happens when the water system sort of breaks down, or what happens if somebody's not going to do this in the city, for example, collect the waste or whatever. What's the potential for us to really understand, because it's such a complex system, and COVID-19 has had so much interdependence across the globe as well. Not one country
Right.
is, can probably put their hands up and say that we're not going to be exposed, or we're not exposed to it. What suggestions would you have for either governments or businesses to really take up what you're suggesting, which is almost not just current, but potential future, the multiple futures? It's like taking multiple futures, the worst case scenarios, and simulating them.
Right. When I look at kids engaging in computer games, so the computer game industry is $150 billion a year. It's probably higher now with people kind of locked at home. So it dwarfs the movie industry, the music industry by a factor of 3 or 4. So it's something that people will, of their own will, engage with for fun, and they'll dig down a lot deeper than they would with something that's very dry and boring. And when you think about the trillions of dollars that these issues have that cascade out, I don't see how people kind of not do this. And if you look at something like SimCity, it made a city kind of approachable and understandable to people. And these things all start with a very simple layer, just like you start with math or another topic in school, but you can dig down over time as you become more familiar. So I've seen teenagers who have mastered these incredibly complex economic and social systems in games who don't like doing their schoolwork. They're actually not good at the same material in school, but they have a unbelievably accurate and detailed internal model of those systems from having played the games. So that same thing can really brought to more important areas that engage you with the world as opposed to isolate you, can really help train people in these cascading consequences.
We've had a viewer actually ask if you could share a link of your simulation, and they just mentioned that they're really interested in the 3D mapping of the system to foster dialogue and multiple perspectives. So do you have a link that they can have a look at?
Yeah, we'll link it off of, there's a link that was sent out to a Planetary Insight Center /BOMA, or planetary.is/BOMA. So we'll put some things up there later, or they can email us for a link, any of the above. So this was done just as kind of a quick prototype for the kids. We've got another one that's a more complex one.
Brilliant. Guy, you had a question.
Yeah, one quick question, which I think could be interesting for decision makers people. Is there a way to use those games as one layer of understanding and then fuse that into tabletop exercises, just as to gain that flesh of human decision making and to get a bigger picture then? That's
a great point, and absolutely, and that's how we think about it at this point, is just as a foil for other conversations. So most of the people that we're talking to, that we work with, could use it in a Zoom context, for example, or in person, but it's never going to be predicting the right answer for them. It may not even suggest the course of action they decide to take, but it gets everyone around the table looking at the same picture, the same situation, having a discussion to get those answers. And importantly, it helps them uncover unintended consequences that no one at the table would have thought of. But yeah, it's 30% of the solution, and the 70% is really people.
Yeah.
Right, we're going to move on. John?
Sorry, just quickly, if I may, Daniel, a quick question on simulation as a way of getting everybody involved in not just sitting on the sidelines, but being actively involved in finding solutions. One debate right now with the COVID situation is that a lot of young people, because they feel that the virus doesn't affect them directly, have, shall we say, found it difficult to fully engage in trying to self-isolate or to work remotely or to take the steps necessary to prevent the virus spread. Would simulation be a way for people who don't feel personally invested in the problem? Could that be a way of getting them invested in it?
It's a great question. I believe so. First, if you look in the United States, 40% of the people in the hospital are between the age of, under 65, I think it's 20 to 65. And 45% of the people in the US are in that age range. So just because they don't die doesn't mean they don't end up in the hospital, and it's not pleasant, is one piece of it. So just illustrating that even without the simulation. But the other is kind of the cascade on society and the effect, like, will they be employed if this isn't taken care of? What will happen to the relatives and so on? I know that after we went through it with my kids, who are already a bit concerned when we go by where the local butcher is, and there's a lady who's probably in her 80s. One of my kids always says, I hope she's okay. She should probably shut down her shop. We should be really careful.
Isn't it? But, you've got, for example, in the UK, we've had an 18-year-old die, and a lot of the youth are actually talking about how, they're absolutely invincible on TikTok. You've got them sort of licking surfaces and things.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a scary one. We're going to have to move on. But John, over to you to introduce our next speaker. Thank you, Daniel.